So there's going to be a Legend of Zelda live action movie. And I think this has been in development for quite a while, or at least the idea. What I do want to preface this with is I read this article and it was by Variety, which I thought was just so funny. Well, amusing to me. What comes after Marvel? Better hope it's not something worse. So this is an article by Variety, and basically what they think is what's worse that's coming are video game adaptations. So again, they just reiterate what they've said before about the crisis at Marvel. Now they're worrying about something worse that's going to happen, apart from the absolute chaos and visual vomit at times that has now become the MCU. So this article then goes on to say that if you want a preview of what movies could turn into after the age of Marvel, look no further than the monster success of Five Nights at Freddy's, a silly, scary horror trifle that became as big as it did because it's based on a video game that's bigger than movies. Video game films have historically sputtered, but this year, the makers of the Super Mario Bros. Movie got it right, and the makers of Five Nights at Freddy's did too, at least commercially. The infiltration of video games into the hearts, minds, and reflexes of young people is a process that's been building for decades, just like the rise of comic book movies. Could we only now finally be entering the sweet spot of video game cinema? If so, it would make the age of Marvel look like the Italian Renaissance. Video game adaptations have had a very mixed, very hit and miss history. I think people pretty much enjoyed The Last of Us as far as its adaptation of the PlayStation game. Yeah, there's been some good ones. I also think Sonic was popular as well, but I did like that one. I think it did very well commercially too. But Uncharted, that was definitely a miss, and I am so salty about that. With Tom Holland as Nathan Drake, that was a complete misfire. I think it did okay at the box office. It wasn't gangbusters. It probably didn't make that much of a profit. But I think most people who are like general audiences thought it was a fine film, fine generic treasure hunting film. So, but for video game fans, man, they would have come out in droves to like see that on repeat. I would have, definitely. I saw it once and yeah, don't have no inclination to see it again. But I've watched the Nathan Fillion fan film, Uncharted, lots of times. And that's great. So what did y'all think about the Five Nights at Freddy's success? See, what's interesting about that is that it only cost $20 million. So it might end up making more of a profit than the Marvels. It's really looking like that. Projections are not good so far. That film cost nearly $300 million, the Marvels. So they have to make a ton of money to even get above water, to even get out of the red and make a profit. And even if they do make a profit, it's not going to be substantial at all. Whereas Five Nights at Freddy's, $20 million film, probably minimal marketing budget too, very cult following online, and obviously they came out in droves to see it opening night, did way better than anyone was expecting, especially since it came out on streaming that same weekend. So I think it was a surprise for even the makers of this film that people would go to see it in theaters. And I think it's the second highest grossing video game film, and the first one was Super Mario Brothers. The writer of this article speculates, are we now looking at a renaissance when it comes to video games as a replacement for comic book genre films? And the writer says that the real problem isn't and never has been the junk that Hollywood makes, as if we were all being force-fed. It's the junk that Hollywood makes because audiences vote for those movies with their ticket dollars. That's the way that movies have always worked, never more so than in the era of zappy populist escapism ushered in by Lucas and Spielberg. That legacy was fully in place when the MCU was just a gleam in Kevin Feige's eye. It will still be in place when the MCU fades. The question is, can movies back off not just from comic books, but from the narcotic lure of compulsive fantasy, and return to something that looks more like the real world? Can moviegoers vote for that? If not, we're all but fated to replace superhero spectacle with something that's equally lacking in nourishment. I fully disagree with this person's assessment that comic book adaptations, the very idea of them, that they will inherently be superficial, that they will also be in that same line of compulsive fantasy and lacking in anything of substance. That is basically what the MCU is now. That it's non-substantive, visual vomit, and they think that that's worse. That will be a worse thing. I have a more optimistic view of that. Yes, I do think that that is a concern, but there are amazing stories in video games that are far from shallow, are far from what has now become the MCU. That is just assembly line of corporate made content. But video games have notoriously been filled with compelling stories that have resonated with gamers for decades. Final Fantasy, filled with amazing characters and storylines that people still think about to this day. And then there's also Zelda. I think a Legend of Zelda film has great potential, only if it's in the hands. And see, this is the key. This is what has been the problem with Marvel recently, is who is behind these productions? What's the motivation for them? Is it purely to create a well-crafted story that audiences will love, that will continue to love, that will like buy the films, that will buy the merchandise, and they'll go to your parks and all this other stuff? Well, it's the people behind it that will make it that way. That's why there were almost 30 plus films that made the Infinity Saga so successful to begin with, because they were amazing movies. I mean, entertaining, yes, but the stories were good. The characters were relatable. They were interesting. They were multi-layered. They had flaws. They had different strengths that really worked together in this dynamic way when they did finally team up in the Avengers multiple times, and just character development that played out over dozens and dozens of movies. They put in the work to get to that point, though, that this just doesn't happen by accident. That a movie like this and the Infinity Saga itself, something like that, doesn't just manifest from nothing. It takes work. It takes time to craft these stories. And also, if you want a multimedia or multi-movie franchise, it takes time to build a roadmap, to build a mythology and lore that will connect everything and be satisfying for the characters itself and satisfying to watch for us and to follow. And I feel like video games, there's some amazing stories there. But it's not just video games themselves that's a concern. So yeah, there's some fun video games. FNAF is not very heady, story-driven. It's lore-driven in a sense, but not your typical like lore and stories. It's kind of chaotic in that way. But it has its own charm to it. That's why, people like it. Kind of hokey charm. I think that's its own thing. That's not typical. FNAF is not typical. That's kind of rare. But for the most part, there's some amazing video game stories. And if you just put that to screen, if you put that in a faithful way, people will follow it. People will engage with it. They will be happy to give you their money because that's what they want. They want what they love to be treated well. And I love the idea of a Zelda movie. But what we want at the end of the day is for it to be good. A good Zelda movie. A good Super Mario movie. A good Uncharted movie. A good Minecraft movie. They're doing that too. It's not the medium that is the problem. The medium isn't shallow. There are some amazing stories out there. It's who's behind it and their motivation for wanting to do something with this IP. So with this built-in fan base, it comes with responsibilities. It comes with a burden of expectations. The fans expect you to treat their beloved IPs well. And it's their right. They should expect that. They should expect you to treat it well, to honor the legacy of these stories, these characters, and provide something that's entertaining and wonderful to watch, that you'll be happy to rewatch. I just don't think they should be discounted just because, they're video games. I just think that's a kind of poor comparison, and this person just making assumptions. Oh, this is bad. We're going to get something worse if people keep going to the theaters to see Super Mario and Five Nights at Freddy's. Oh, we're going to get awful movies now. Like, we've been getting poor video game adaptations before, but if they do it right, it can be incredibly successful. And there are some amazing stories that are just ripe for adaptation that fans will just be chomping at the bit to see.